All right. Well, if you watched any of the political Sunday shows this weekend, it may have felt a little bit like stepping back into a time machine, back to the era of President George W. Bush. This entire week, torture enthusiasts have been back on all of the channels, proclaiming their happiness that the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques worked. Take a look.
I think that anyone who suggests that the enhanced techniques, let's be blunt, waterboarding, did not produce an enormous amount of valuable intelligence just isn't facing the truth.
Shows that enhanced interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed provided a vast treasure trove, if you will, of intelligence. So it was a good program. It was a legal program. It was not torture. And I would strongly recommend that we continue it.
These are not torture. These are techniques that we know worked. That debate is over. It worked. It got the intelligence. It wasn't torture. It was legal.
I think without the enhanced interrogation methods authorized by President Bush, combined with the warrantless surveillance, we never would have found where bin Laden was hiding, because we never would have known the identity and location of the courier.
So how did the killing of bin Laden turn into a debate over whether torture actually works? And why are we rehashing the past instead of trying to figure out how to move America forward in its endless war on terror? Well, here with me to discuss is Jacob Hornberger. He's the president of the Future Freedom Foundation. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you back in the studio.
Thank you.
So what was your impression after seeing these folks come out of all the channels? Why is this the debate that we're having right now, the torture debate?
Well, my impression was these were all the dead-enders that took our nation down the road to shame, to evil, to torture. They were trying to rehabilitate themselves in an equally shameful way. They really ought to just go back in a hole and stay there.
Go back in a hole and stay there. And, of course, the news media is also just as complicit in this because, you know, we could, as journalists, be asking more important questions. For example, now that public enemy number one is dead, how do we move on in the fight against al-Qaeda, against terrorism? And how do we perhaps try to begin the process of winning back all of the civil liberties that have been eroded over the past decade during the war on terror? What's your take on that?
Well, the killing of Osama bin Laden is not going to change anything, and they don't intend it to change anything. In fact, notice that the terror alerts have gone up since he was killed. And you've got now all these new threats that are from people that are angry over the killing. You've got this war on terrorism that's perpetual. I mean, it's better than the drug war or the Cold War. I mean, it's like this perpetual enemy. They kill one guy, they produce 10 more. The civil liberties, we're going to see greater infringements on the civil liberties because they got to keep us safe from all these threats that they're producing. And Lucy, at the bottom line, it's all about the U.S. empire and the so-called right of the empire to dominate the world, and that's the root of this thing.
How do we move forward past this? I mean, if we are fighting an enemy like al-Qaeda that is landless, that's more of a brand than an actual top-down organization, I mean, you can assassinate all the people you want, but the threat remains. And more importantly, do you think that we're hurting ourselves more by allowing these kind of policies to go through, this rendition and keeping folks detained without due right to justice? Could we be hurting our country more by continuing those kinds of policies?
Oh, there's no question about it. And now, of course, they've extended these powers to Americans. I mean, all we need is a right crisis. And they have the same powers, ironically, that these dictators in the Middle East have. You know, the enemy combatant doctrine, the rendition doctrine, the kidnapping, indefinite detention. I mean, ultimately, I think Americans have to confront a fundamental issue. Do you want your country to be an empire where you've got troops occupying countries in the Middle East, torturing people, kidnapping people, and torturing people? Because if you want that, then you're going to be living this abnormal, perverse life where the government's constantly monitoring you, checking on you, infringing on your civil liberties. That there's only one way to stop all this and return to a normally functioning, prosperous society. Get the troops out of everywhere, bring them home, discharge them, and then you eliminate all the anger and rage that foreigners have that ultimately manifests itself in a terrorist retaliatory strike.
But how do you do that? I mean, in this climate, politicians are not going to talk about withdrawing troops immediately because it makes them look weak on defense. They're not going to talk about backpedaling on the Patriot Act and warrantless wiretapping and all the other policies that are in place because they don't want to seem weak. And moreover, when you're talking about lawmakers, I mean, if you're talking about the military-industrial complex, there's big money that goes into keeping these folks elected. There's big money that goes into contracts for military operations. And so there's a financial vested interest in keeping things as status quo and keeping them the way they are.
Absolutely. You've got power and money, and those are the two big ingredients in all this. But ideas have power. They have consequences. I mean, you know, I heard somewhat the same argument during the Cold War where the people said, how do you bring down the Soviet Union? They have all the guns. They have a monopoly of force in the Eastern European countries. But through the power of ideas, people talking about what it means to be free, what it means to have a normally functioning society, they brought down the wall in the Soviet Empire peacefully. That same thing can happen here. That's what scares these people, is the power of ideas. You see people like Ron Paul and Gary Johnson that are now running for president, bringing these ideas into the forefront of the political arena. This is very exciting, but it threatens these people that you're talking about that are making big money and gaining big power over these policies.
Well, and then you can still make the argument that a lot of the mainstream press still marginalizes candidates like that and ideas like that. But, I mean, you made the contrast with the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War. But when you're dealing with something like the war on terror, which is by definition perpetual, because terror is not a country or a wall that can fall, how do you move past that? I mean, the powers that be, in my personal view, seem to be able to justify an endless conflict if there's no defined enemy and defined benchmarks by which you end that war.
Well, they've convinced people that the reason there's a terrorist threat is because foreigners hate America for its freedom and values. I mean, we heard Bush say that after 9/11. If people can figure out that that's not the case at all, that what's happening is you've got anger and rage over what the U.S. government is doing to people in the Middle East and in Latin America with the drug war, all over the world. If people figure that out, then they might simply say, you know what, it's not worth it to us to have this empire. We want to end that, and then all of a sudden the terrorist threat evaporates, and you don't need all these troops and CIA and all this other stuff to protect us against the threats that they themselves are producing with their policies.
And just to get your opinion quickly, is it almost too little too late? Have we, has the United States as a country wreaked enough havoc in its various wars in the Middle East to maybe not even be able to backpedal on that impression that's so seemingly firm abroad in the anti-American column?
I don't think so. I mean, this government killed more than 1 million Vietnamese people, and as soon as it withdrew from Vietnam, none of the Vietnamese people came over and retaliated. They had lost family members. I think most people are sick and tired of perpetual war, including people in the Middle East. There might be some people that might retaliate because their mother or their daughter was killed in all these conflicts, but that's an isolated type thing. The major threat is eliminated when the empire is forced to withdraw its troops from all these countries and end the foreign aid for the dictators that, you know, all the dictators were supporting, end the foreign aid to the Israeli regime. Then all of a sudden you can end the torture, the kidnapping, the rendition, the assassinations, and all this stuff. I mean, this is the only way to lead our country out of this thing. Otherwise, you're just trimming the branches. You're not pulling the weed out by its root.
Right, and I guess it depends to be seen whether this is something that's going to happen by free will of the politicians or maybe something that would be forced into because of the unsustainable economic situation that we're in.
Well, that's right, because they're sending this nation into bankruptcy with all the money they're spending on this thing.
Well, it's difficult times that we live in for sure. Thank you so much. That was Jacob Hornberger, the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation.